Welcome to this journey into one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of antebellum Alabama. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now and what time it is for you. Are you watching this alone in the middle of the night, or perhaps during a quiet afternoon? Leave a comment below telling me your location and the time. There's something about sharing these stories together across time zones and distances that makes our community of truth seekers even stronger. The year is 1853. The state of Alabama sits on the precipice of a conflict that will tear the nation apart, but in the rural stretches of Wilcox County, life continues as it has for decades. Cotton plantations stretch across the landscape like white oceans, and the social order of the Old South remains firmly, brutally entrenched. It is here, along a bend in the Alabama River, that the Shadowbrook Plantation rises from the red clay earth. A monument to wealth built on the backs of 87 enslaved souls. The mistress of Shadowbrook is Jennifer Whitmore, a 42-year-old widow who inherited the estate after her husband's sudden death in 1852. Historical records from the Wilcox County archives describe her as an educated woman, unusual for her time, with an extensive personal library and a keen interest in the emerging sciences of heredity and bloodlines. Her neighbors considered her eccentric, but respected her business acumen. She ran Shadowbrook with mechanical precision, maintaining detailed ledgers that documented every aspect of plantation life. But Jennifer Whitmore harbored an obsession that went far beyond cotton yields and profit margins. In the immediate months following her husband's death, she implemented a rule within her household that defied every social convention of her era. Her three legitimate children, Thomas, Margaret, and William, were forbidden from marrying outside the plantation. More disturbing still, Jennifer decreed that her heirs must produce children exclusively with the enslaved people of Shadowbrook, not as secret affairs hidden in shame, but as a deliberate, documented program that she personally supervised and recorded in cipher. For 5 years between 1853 and 1858, Jennifer Whitmore conducted what can only be described as a genealogical experiment. 14 children were born from these forced unions, each one meticulously documented in Jennifer's personal journals. These infants were not sent to the slave quarters. Instead, they were kept in a sealed wing of the main mansion, raised according to Jennifer's strict protocols, their existence known to few outside the plantation's borders. And then, on the night of August 12, 1858, during a violent summer storm that locals still remember in their oral histories, every member of the Whitmore family vanished. Jennifer, her 3 adult children, and all 14 of the forbidden heirs disappeared without a trace. No bodies were ever found. No ransom notes ever arrived. The enslaved population of Shadowbrook, suddenly and inexplicably freed from their captors, scattered into the night, taking their testimonies with them. What remained were Jennifer's journals, written in a cipher that would not be cracked until 1923. What remained were daguerreotype photographs of children with haunting, identical expressions. What remained were whispered stories of torchlight processions in the mansion's basement, of screams that echoed from the sealed wing, of Jennifer Whitmore standing in the cotton fields at midnight, speaking to people who were not there. The Shadowbrook case has puzzled historians, genealogists, and investigators for over a century and a half. Some believe the enslaved population rose up and executed the Whitmore family, hiding the evidence so completely that no trace would ever be found. Others point to the mysterious tunnel system discovered beneath the mansion in the 1920s, suggesting an elaborate escape plan. And still others, those who have spent years studying Jennifer's decoded journals, believe something far darker transpired in that sealed wing, something that involved Jennifer's obsession with bloodlines, her strange rituals, and her unshakable belief that she was creating a new kind of dynasty, What you are about to hear is the result of extensive research into courthouse archives, private collections, oral histories, and archaeological evidence. This is the story of Jennifer Whitmore and the forbidden dynasty of Shadowbrook, a tale that asks us to confront the horrifying extremes of human control, the legacies we cannot escape, and the secrets that refuse to stay buried. To understand the darkness that consumed Shadowbrook, we must first understand the world in which it existed. The Alabama of 1853 was a place of profound contradictions, where the ideals of Southern gentility masked a social structure built entirely on enslavement and violence. Wilcox County, located in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, so named for its rich, dark soil, was among the wealthiest regions in the state. Cotton was king, and those who controlled the land controlled everything. The Whitmore family had established themselves in Alabama in the 1820s, part of the Great Migration of planters from the exhausted tobacco fields of Virginia and the Carolinas. Jennifer's husband, Robert Whitmore, had been a second son who purchased Shadowbrook with inherited money and quickly expanded it into one of the largest operations in the county. By the time of his death in 1852, the plantation encompassed nearly 3,000 acres and held 87 enslaved people, making it a significant economic force. Robert's death came suddenly. The official cause, recorded in the county death register, was listed as heart failure. He was 48 years old, in apparent good health, and collapsed while inspecting the cotton gin house on a September afternoon. The local physician, Dr. Marcus Thornton, signed the death certificate without performing an autopsy, a common practice at the time. Robert was buried in the family plot within 48 hours, as was customary in the Alabama heat. Jennifer Whitmore did not wear mourning clothes beyond the required 3 months. Letters from her sister, preserved in the archives of the Alabama Department of History, suggest that Jennifer viewed her husband's death as a liberation rather than a tragedy. In one letter, dated January 1853, she writes with barely concealed excitement about her plans to reorganize the plantation according to her own vision, mentioning that she has finally been freed from Robert's conventional thinking. The 3 Whitmore children were products of their era and class. Thomas, the eldest at 23, had been educated at the University of Alabama and was expected to inherit Shadowbrook. Margaret, 20 years old, had been raised to become the wife of a prominent planter, educated in music, French, and household management. William, the youngest at 18, had shown aptitude for engineering and had spent a year studying in Mobile. All 3 returned to Shadowbrook after their father's death, as was expected. What none of them anticipated was their mother's radical transformation. Within weeks of Robert's burial, Jennifer began making changes that shocked the county's planter society. She dismissed the white overseer and took direct control of plantation operations, an unprecedented move for a woman of her station. She stopped attending church services, claiming the local minister was intellectually inferior. Most disturbing to her peers, she began acquiring books on subjects considered unseemly for a lady: anatomy, heredity, animal breeding, and the emerging pseudoscience of racial classification. Jennifer's library, catalogued after the disappearance, contained works by Samuel Morton, whose measurements of human skulls were used to justify racial hierarchies, and Josiah Knott, a mobile physician who published theories about separate human origins. She owned agricultural journals that discussed selective breeding in livestock, and she had annotated these texts extensively, often writing in the margins about applications to human populations. One particularly chilling notation, found in a treatise on horse breeding, reads in her handwriting, "If we can perfect the thoroughbred through careful selection, why not our own line?" The enslaved community at Shadowbrook in 1853 was diverse, ranging from individuals born on the plantation to others purchased at auction in Montgomery and Mobile. Records show that Jennifer maintained detailed files on each person, documenting not just their labor productivity, but their physical characteristics, health histories, and family relationships. She kept these records in a leather-bound ledger, separate from the standard plantation books, and this ledger was found intact in 1923. Life under Jennifer's management was, according to later testimonies collected by researchers in the 1930s from descendants of Shadowbrook's enslaved population, different from other plantations in ways both subtle and profound. Physical punishments were rare, but psychological control was absolute. Jennifer instituted a system of surveillance where enslaved people were required to report on each other's activities. She separated families, not for sale, but for what she called genetic diversity. She kept detailed medical records and conducted regular inspections of the population. But the most disturbing aspect of Jennifer's transformation came in the spring of 1853, approximately 6 months after her husband's death. According to a diary entry later decoded, this is when she first conceived what she called the Shadowbrook experiment. The entry, dated March 15, 1853, reads in translation, "The old lines are corrupt, the conventions are lies. True nobility must be forged through will and science. I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resolve. My children will be the vessels. Shadowbrook will become something the world has never seen." What Jennifer meant by this cryptic statement would not become clear until the summer of 1853, when she gathered her 3 children and informed them of their new duties. No written record of this conversation exists, but its consequences are documented in multiple sources. Thomas, Margaret, and William would not be allowed to marry into other planter families. Instead, they would remain at Shadowbrook and participate in their mother's program of controlled reproduction with selected individuals from the enslaved population. The moral horror of this decree cannot be overstated. Jennifer was not simply continuing the common but hidden practice of white men fathering children with enslaved women. She was systematizing it, documenting it, and extending it to include her daughter, creating a program of coerced reproduction that served her obsessive belief in creating a bloodline under her complete control. She was treating human beings as breeding stock in a demented experiment that merged the era's racist pseudoscience with her own megalomania. How did her children respond? The historical record provides only fragments. Thomas's personal correspondence, 3 letters that survived, shows a young man torn between filial obedience and moral revulsion. In one letter to a college friend, he writes vaguely about unbearable demands and his mother's dangerous preoccupations, but never provides details. Margaret left no written records, but later testimonies suggest she withdrew into herself, spending days in her room. William, the youngest, appears to have initially resisted, but eventually complied. A notation in Jennifer's cipher journal from July 1853 reads, "William understands now. They all will." By the fall of 1853, Jennifer Whitmore's experiment had begun in earnest. The sealed wing of the mansion was prepared. The first children would be born by spring of 1854. And Shadowbrook Plantation, already a place of bondage and suffering, was about to become something far worse. A laboratory of human control where a mother's obsession would create a legacy of horror that persists to this day. The first child of what Jennifer called her new dynasty was born on April 3, 1854. The mother was a young woman named Sarah, approximately 17 years old, who had been born on the plantation. The father, according to Jennifer's decoded journal, was Thomas Whitmore. The infant, a boy, was designated in Jennifer's records as Subject 1 and given the name Josiah. He was immediately removed from his mother and taken to the sealed eastern wing of the mansion. This pattern would repeat 13 more times over the following 4 years. Jennifer maintained meticulous records of each birth, the date, the time, the physical characteristics of the infant, and detailed notes about the parents' traits she hoped would manifest. She kept photographic documentation, commissioning a traveling daguerreotypist to create portraits of each child at 6-month intervals. These photographs, discovered in a trunk in 1923, show infants and toddlers dressed in identical white gowns, posed against the same dark backdrop, their expressions uniform and unsettling. What happened in the sealed wing has been pieced together from multiple sources. Physical evidence examined after the disappearance showed that the space had been converted into a nursery, unlike anything in the antebellum South. Jennifer had imported specialized furniture from New York and Boston, medical equipment typically found only in hospitals, and an extensive collection of educational materials for young children. The walls were painted white, unusual for the era, and the windows had been fitted with interior shutters that could be locked from the outside. Most disturbing were the observation logs. Jennifer visited the sealed wing multiple times daily, recording detailed notes about each child's development. She measured their growth, tested their reflexes, noted their behavior, and documented their interactions with each other. The children were cared for by 2 enslaved women, Patience and Ruth, who were kept isolated from the rest of the plantation population and forbidden from speaking about what they witnessed. Testimony from Patience's granddaughter, recorded by a WPA researcher in 1937, provides a glimpse into the sealed wing. The old woman, then in her 80s, recalled her grandmother's traumatized silence about her years in the mansion, broken only once near the end of her life. According to this account, Patience whispered that the children were beautiful and terrible, that they moved together like a single creature, and that Mistress Jennifer spoke to them in a language nobody else understood. The biological mothers of these children were not allowed contact after birth. Jennifer's journal indicates she believed maternal influence would contaminate her. Experiment. Sarah, the mother of Subject 1, attempted to see her son repeatedly and was eventually confined to the slave quarters under guard. In July 1854, she disappeared from the plantation. Jennifer's journal entry for that date reads simply, "S has been removed. The necessary measures have been taken. No record exists of what happened to Sarah, and her name never appears in Jennifer's records again." By 1856, there were 8 children in the sealed wing, ranging in age from newborn to 2 years old. Jennifer's journals from this period show increasing obsession with what she called the purification process. She began incorporating strange rituals into the children's daily routine. Ceremonies, she claimed, would strengthen their bloodline connection to Shadowbrook itself. These rituals involved soil from specific locations on the plantation, water from the Alabama River, and recitations that blended pseudo-scientific language with religious invocation. The enslaved community at Shadowbrook lived in a state of controlled terror. Those selected by Jennifer for her breeding program had no choice but to comply. Resistance meant punishment, not just for the individual, but for their entire family. Multiple sources suggest that Jennifer used a system of collective responsibility, where one person's defiance resulted in consequences for others. This ensured cooperation through fear and guilt. Tell us in the comments what you think was happening in the sealed wing. Was Jennifer Whitmore simply documenting her experiment, or was something more sinister taking place? What do you believe the rituals were meant to accomplish? Your theories help us piece together this disturbing puzzle. As the number of children grew, so did whispers among the neighboring plantations. Visitors to Shadowbrook noted the absence of Thomas, Margaret, and William from social events. Letters between planter families, preserved in various archives, mention concerns about the Whitmores' withdrawal from society. One letter from a neighboring plantation mistress, dated November 1856, describes Jennifer as transformed into someone unrecognizable, with eyes that look through you rather than at you. The Whitmore children themselves seem to age rapidly during these years. A plantation supply ledger from 1857 includes a notation from a merchant who delivered goods to Shadowbrook, describing Thomas Whitmore as appearing 20 years older than his actual age of 27, with grey hair and a haunted expression. Margaret was reportedly seen by a travelling seamstress who came to take measurements and later told others that Miss Whitmore had the look of someone who had died inside. In Jennifer's journals, entries about her adult children become increasingly cold and clinical. She refers to them by initial only, T.M.W. She notes their compliance or resistance to specific aspects of her program. In March 1857, she writes, "M requires reinforcement, has forgotten her purpose." The Aishi punishment room will remind her. This mention of a punishment room had never appeared in earlier entries and suggests an escalation in Jennifer's methods of control. The 14th and final child, designated Subject 14, was born in February 1858. The mother was a woman named Eliza, and the father was William Whitmore. Jennifer's journal entry for this birth is notably brief. The final piece is placed. The bloodline is complete. The transformation can begin. What transformation she meant has been debated by researchers for decades. In the months between this final birth and the disappearance in August 1858, activity at Shadowbrook became increasingly strange. Multiple independent sources, including a county tax assessor who visited in May and a circuit preacher who stopped by in June, reported unusual sights and sounds. The tax assessor noted in his official records that the mansion appeared to be under some kind of quarantine, with the shutters closed and a strange silence pervading the grounds. The preacher wrote in his diary that he heard children singing inside the house, their voices in perfect unison, though he never saw them. The enslaved population was by this time kept under even stricter control. Work continued in the fields, but movement between the quarters and the mansion was severely restricted. Armed guards, hired from outside the county, patrolled the property at night. Several enslaved people attempted to escape during this period. According to records, 2 were caught and returned, but at least 3 successfully fled to freedom. Their testimonies, recorded years later by abolitionists, describe Shadowbrook in its final months as a place that felt wrong, where the very air seemed heavy with dread. Jennifer's final journal entries, written in July and early August 1858, become increasingly erratic and cryptic. The cipher remains consistent, but the content grows fragmented. She writes about alignments of blood and soil, about the old, families sleeping beneath, about her children finally understanding their destiny. One of the last entries, dated August 10th, 1858, just 2 days before the disappearance, reads, "The children are ready. The dynasty will rise. Shadowbrook will take its rightful place. Tomorrow night we descend." What happened in those final 48 hours? What did Jennifer mean by "we descend"? The answers, or what remains of them, lie in the events of August 12, 1858, a night that would leave more questions than any investigation could answer. August 12, 1858, began as an oppressively hot day in Wilcox County, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and the earth crack. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the western horizon, and by sunset, a storm system was moving rapidly across the Alabama River Valley. Local weather records from the period describe it as one of the most violent thunderstorms in county memory, with lightning that turned night into day and rain that fell in solid sheets. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, according to later testimonies, the enslaved population of Shadowbrook was ordered into their quarters and the doors were barred from outside. This was unusual, but not unprecedented during severe weather. What was unprecedented was that the guards who normally patrolled the plantation grounds were dismissed and told not to return until the following afternoon. This detail comes from a statement given by one of these guards, recorded in county legal documents during the subsequent investigation. Inside the main mansion, lights blazed from every window despite the storm. Multiple witnesses from neighboring properties, located as close as a mile away, reported seeing the unusual illumination and hearing sounds beneath the thunder, voices raised in unison, possibly chanting or singing, though the words were impossible to distinguish over the storm's fury. One witness, a freedman named Tobias Green, who lived on an adjacent property, stated in his testimony that the voices sounded like children, dozens of children, though he knew the Whitmore household had no such number of young ones, at least none that anyone had seen. At some point, between 10 o'clock and midnight, the lights in the mansion went dark, not gradually, as if candles and lamps were being extinguished one by one, but all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain over the entire building. The timing coincided with the storm's peak intensity, and several witnesses assumed the winds had somehow put out all the lights simultaneously. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose on a Shadowbrook that appeared from the outside entirely normal. The cotton fields were damaged but not destroyed. Fallen branches littered the grounds, and the mansion stood intact. But when the guards returned that afternoon as instructed, they found something that defied explanation. The main house was completely empty. Not empty in the sense of being abandoned, with belongings scattered about. Empty in the sense that it appeared the occupants had systematically prepared for an absence. Food had been removed from the pantries. Personal items were gone from the bedrooms. The library, which had contained hundreds of volumes, was stripped bare. In the sealed wing, the children's furniture remained, but there were no clothes, no toys, no personal effects of any kind. It was as if Jennifer Whitmore had planned a departure and taken everything of value or meaning with her. But there were no wagons or carriages missing from the carriage house. No horses were gone from the stables. The ferry that crossed the Alabama River reported no crossing that night due to the storm. The roads were washed out in multiple places, making travel by conventional means essentially impossible. And most puzzling of all, there was no indication of where 20 people, 3 adults and 14 children ranging in age from infant to 4 years old, could have gone in the middle of a violent storm without leaving a single trace. The enslaved population, released from their locked quarters the following morning, found the mansion as the guards had. They were as bewildered as anyone. Some, seizing the moment, fled the plantation immediately. Others remained uncertain of their status. Within days, word of the disappearance had spread throughout the county, and an official investigation was launched. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, whose reports are preserved in the county archives, conducted interviews and searched the property. His final report, filed in September 1858, concluded that the Whitmore family had departed Shadowbrook of their own accord, destination unknown, and that no crime appeared to have been committed. The case was closed. But this official conclusion satisfied no one, and as the months passed and no word came from any member of the Whitmore family, speculation turned to darker theories. In October 1858, approximately 2 months after the disappearance, a group of former Shadowbrook enslaved people returned to the plantation to claim personal items they had been forced to leave behind. Among them was a man named Samuel, who had worked as a carpenter on the property for 15 years. Samuel knew the mansion's layout better than most, and he remembered something strange he had noticed years earlier. The basement ceiling was significantly higher than the basement floor should be, given the mansion's foundation. With the property effectively abandoned and no authority preventing them, Samuel and 3 others began investigating the basement more thoroughly. What they discovered would be the first of many revelations that suggested the Whitmore disappearance was far more complex than a simple departure. Behind a large storage shelf filled with empty crates, they found a door. It was not hidden with any great sophistication, just overlooked because the shelf had always stood in front of it. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron, and it opened to reveal a stone staircase descending into darkness. Using lanterns, the group descended approximately 20 feet into a chamber that none of them had known existed. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with walls of fitted stone that showed considerable skill in construction. The ceiling was vaulted, and along the walls were alcoves, each containing what appeared to be personal items: clothes, shoes, books, and in several cases, daguerreotype photographs. The photographs showed the children from the sealed wing, individually and in groups. One photograph in particular disturbed the explorers. It showed all 14 children arranged in a circle, holding hands, with Jennifer Whitmore standing in the center, her arms raised. But more disturbing than the alcoves was the center of the chamber. There, carved directly into the stone floor, was an elaborate design that combined geometric patterns with what appeared to be genealogical information. Names were inscribed in concentric circles, connected by lines indicating relationships. At the outermost circle were the names of enslaved individuals from Shadowbrook. The next circle inward contained the names Thomas, Margaret, and William. The innermost circle contained the names of the 14 children, and at the very center, a single name, Jennifer. Around the perimeter of this carved design were symbols that none of the discoverers recognized. They appeared to be a mixture of letters and geometric shapes, possibly the same cipher Jennifer had used in her journals. Surrounding the entire design were what appeared to be drainage channels, carved into the floor and leading to a central depression beneath Jennifer's name. Samuel and his companions were frightened by what they had found, but they were also practical people who had survived years of enslavement through caution. They took several of the photographs and items from the alcoves as evidence and then sealed the basement room, replacing the shelf in front of the door. They brought their findings to the county sheriff, hoping for a renewed investigation. Sheriff Blackwood examined the items but ultimately dismissed their significance. In his supplementary report from November 1858, he wrote that the basement chamber was clearly a family crypt or memorial space, that the carvings were simply genealogical records, and that the photographs were normal family keepsakes. He suggested that Samuel and the others were letting their imaginations run wild due to the mysterious circumstances of the disappearance. No further official investigation was conducted. The items taken from the chamber were eventually donated to the County Historical Society, where they remained in storage for decades. The basement chamber itself, with no one maintaining the property, was eventually forgotten. Shadowbrook Plantation fell into disrepair, was partially destroyed by fire in the 1870s, and by the turn of the century, was little more than ruins slowly being reclaimed by the Alabama wilderness. But the story of the Whitmore disappearance remained alive in local memory, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale and an unsolved mystery. The true horror of what had transpired at Shadowbrook would not begin to come to light until 1923, 65 years after the disappearance. That year, a graduate student in history from the University of Alabama named Margaret Thorne became interested in antebellum plantation records as part of her thesis research. While examining archived materials in Montgomery, she came across a collection of items labeled Whitmore Family, Wilcox County, including several leather-bound journals written in cipher. Thorne had studied cryptography as a hobby and recognized that the cipher, while complex, was based on a substitution system that could potentially be broken with sufficient time and effort. She spent 8 months working on the journals, gradually developing a key that allowed her to translate Jennifer Whitmore's private writings. What she discovered, recorded in her own notes, now held by the Alabama Department of Archives and History, caused her to temporarily abandon her research due to what she described as severe psychological distress. The decoded journals revealed the full scope of Jennifer's obsession and her plans for Shadowbrook. She had not simply been documenting a breeding program, but rather implementing what she believed was a ritual practice that would create a new form of dynasty, one that transcended normal human limitations. Jennifer had been influenced by a mixture of sources: eugenic pseudoscience, occult texts she had acquired through underground networks, and her own megalomaniacal belief that she could engineer a family line that would be bound to Shadowbrook itself in perpetuity. The journals described the rituals in the basement chamber in disturbing detail. Jennifer believed that by binding her adult children to the enslaved people through reproduction, and then conducting ceremonies that she claimed would tie these children to the plantation's soil, she could create what she called an eternal bloodline. The children in the sealed wing were not just being raised in isolation, but were being prepared for what Jennifer described as the Great Transformation. Most chilling were Jennifer's entries from the final weeks before the disappearance. She wrote about how the children had been prepared through years of careful conditioning and ritual exposure. She described their diet, which included soil from specific locations on the plantation mixed with their food. She wrote about teaching them what she called the language of the blood, a series of chants and phrases that she claimed would activate their connection to Shadowbrook. And she wrote repeatedly about the night of transformation, when the family would descend together and complete the process. On August 10th, 1858, 2 days before the disappearance, Jennifer wrote, "All preparations are complete. The storm will provide the necessary energy. The chamber is ready. T, M, and W understand their role finally after all these years of resistance. They have seen what the children have become, and they know there is no other path. Tomorrow night we descend into the earth that owns us, and we rise as something new. The dynasty will be eternal. Shadowbrook will never release us because we will never leave." Margaret Thorne's translation of this passage and her interpretation of what it suggested formed the basis of a theory that she presented in a limited academic publication in 1925. She proposed that Jennifer Whitmore, in a state of complete psychotic delusion, had conducted some form of ritual in the basement chamber on the night of August 12, 1858. Whether this ritual was intended as symbolic or whether Jennifer actually believed it would produce supernatural results, Thorne could not say. But she suggested that the disappearance might not have been a departure at all, but rather a mass death, with the bodies disposed of in a manner that left no trace. This theory was controversial and largely dismissed by mainstream historians at the time, but it would gain new credibility within the decade when archaeological evidence emerged that changed everything. In 1931, during a severe drought that lowered the water table throughout Alabama, a collapse occurred on the former Shadowbrook property. A section of ground approximately 20 feet in diameter suddenly gave way, creating a sinkhole that revealed what had been hidden beneath the soil for decades: an extensive tunnel system. Local authorities initially assumed the tunnels were related to the Underground Railroad, a network that had operated in some parts of Alabama despite the dangers. However, Examination by a civil engineer hired by the county revealed that these tunnels were far more sophisticated and purposefully designed than the crude escape routes typically associated with freedom seekers. The tunnel system, as mapped by subsequent investigations, consisted of a main passage approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, running from the ruins of the Shadowbrook mansion basement to a location approximately 300 yards away, near the banks of the Alabama River. Off this main passage were multiple side chambers, each approximately 10 feet square, carved from the clay soil and reinforced with timber and brick. In total, the system encompassed over 500 linear feet of tunnels and 12 separate chambers. What was found in these chambers prompted the most extensive investigation of the Whitmore case since 1858. In 3 separate chambers, investigators discovered human remains. The skeletal evidence suggested multiple individuals of varying ages, including several children. The remains were in poor condition due to soil acidity and water infiltration, but enough material was preserved to conduct analysis. Dr. Harold Westbrook, a physician and amateur archaeologist who participated in the investigation, documented his findings in a series of letters to colleagues that are now part of the historical record. He noted that the remains showed no obvious signs of trauma or violence. There were no bullet holes in bones, no evidence of blunt force injury, no indication of stabbing or other assault. The individuals appeared to have died from unknown causes, possibly illness, possibly poisoning, possibly suffocation or some other method that left no mark on skeletal material. More disturbing were the artifacts found with the remains. In each chamber containing bones, investigators found personal items that matched descriptions from Jennifer's journals, clothes of a type fashionable in the 1850s, toys consistent with those manufactured for wealthy children of that era, and in one case, a locket containing a daguerreotype of a young woman identified from other sources as Margaret Whitmore. There were also items specific to enslaved populations, simple pottery, handmade tools, fragments of cloth consistent with slave clothing. But most significant was the discovery in the chamber furthest from the mansion, near the river end of the tunnel system. This chamber, larger than the others, contained what appeared to be a ritual arrangement. Bones were positioned in a circular pattern, echoing the carved design found in the basement chamber decades earlier. At the center of this circle was a metal box, badly corroded but still intact enough to open. Inside the box were pages from what appeared to be Jennifer Whitmore's journals, the final entries never found in the main collection. These pages, partially destroyed by moisture and time, contained fragmented text that suggested Jennifer's final thoughts. One partially legible passage read, "The children are sleeping now in the earth as they should. The blood returns to the soil. We are bound forever to this ground. T and M and W have finally accepted. The transformation is not what I expected, but it is complete. Shadowbrook holds us in ways I did not foresee. We cannot leave. We will never leave." The implications of this discovery were staggering. It suggested that the disappearance had indeed ended in death, that Jennifer Whitmore had led her family and the children into the tunnel system on that storm-swept night in August 1858, and that something had occurred there which resulted in their deaths. Whether through poison, suffocation in a sealed chamber, or some other method, the family had perished underground. The question remained, was this murder, mass taking of life, or had Jennifer somehow convinced her adult children to participate willingly in what she presented as a ritual transformation? The investigation of 1931-1932 attempted to answer these questions, but ultimately raised more. The remains were too degraded to establish definitive cause of death. The number of individuals could not be precisely determined due to the commingling of bones and the poor preservation. Dental records and other identification methods of the era were insufficient to conclusively prove that any specific remains belonged to the Whitmore family members. The story of Shadowbrook did not end with the discoveries of the 1930s. Over subsequent decades, additional pieces of the puzzle emerged, each one adding layers to the mystery while resolving nothing definitively. In 1947, during the renovation of an old general store in the town of Camden, approximately 15 miles from the former Shadowbrook Plantation, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the floorboards. Inside were letters addressed to various recipients throughout Alabama and neighboring states, all written in 1858 and apparently never mailed. Several of these letters were signed by Thomas Whitmore. The letters, now held by the Camden Historical Society, paint a picture of a man in psychological torment. In one letter to a former college professor, Thomas writes, "I'm trapped in a nightmare of my mother's creation. She has convinced Margaret and William that her mad theories are truth, that we are creating something noble rather than participating in horror. I have tried to resist, but she holds leverage over all of us. She knows secrets, has documented things that would destroy us if revealed. I see no escape. Each day I feel more of myself disappearing into the role she has written for me." Why? Were these letters never mailed? Did Thomas hide them deliberately, intending to retrieve them later, or were they discovered by Jennifer and hidden away to prevent his call for help from reaching anyone? The letters provide a window into the psychological control Jennifer exerted over her children, but they also raise questions about culpability. If Thomas, Margaret, and William were victims of their mother's manipulation, at what point did they become willing participants in the program that harmed so many others? In 1955, a researcher named Dr. Franklin Pierce, studying genealogical records of African-American families in the region, made a startling discovery. He found descendants of Shadowbrook's enslaved population who carried oral histories about children who had been born from the forced unions of the 1850s, but who had somehow survived the events of 1858. According to these accounts, not all 14 children had disappeared with Jennifer that night. The testimony of Clara, Washington, recorded by Dr. Pierce, was particularly significant. Clara was the great-granddaughter of Patience, one of the two enslaved women who had cared for the children in the sealed wing. According to family history passed down through 3 generations, Patience had managed to hide 2 of the youngest children during the chaos of the storm on August 12th. She had taken them to the slave quarters, concealed them, and then, when the plantation was abandoned, she had fled with them to freedom. These 2 children, a boy and a girl, had been raised in secret, their true parentage never revealed. Dr. Pierce attempted to verify this account through genealogical research and found tantalizing suggestions that it might be true. He identified 2 family lines in Alabama and Mississippi that, when traced backward, appeared to originate with children born approximately in the 1856-1858 time frame, who had no documented parents but who had been raised by women with connections to Wilcox County. However, the evidence was circumstantial. No definitive proof could be established, and many in the academic community dismissed the oral histories as wishful thinking or embellishment. But if 2 children did escape, it raises a profound question. What became of the other 12? Were they among the remains found in the tunnels, or did they meet some other fate? And if Patience saved 2, why not more? The questions multiply rather than resolve. In 1963, during the Civil Rights era, when many historical injustices were being re-examined, a journalist named Robert Kimball wrote a series of articles about Shadowbrook for a regional newspaper. Kimball interviewed several elderly residents of Wilcox County who remembered stories told by their grandparents about strange occurrences at the abandoned plantation site in the decades after 1858. Multiple sources told similar stories. of figures seen walking through the ruined cotton fields at dusk, appearing and disappearing without explanation, of voices heard singing in unison, the same disturbing harmony that had been reported during the mansion's final days, of travelers who passed near the property at night, reporting an overwhelming sense of dread that had no rational source. These accounts were dismissed as folklore and superstition, but their consistency across multiple unconnected sources is notable. One particularly detailed account came from a man named James Tucker, who in 1963 was 87 years old. Tucker claimed that in 1919, when he was a young man of 43, he had been hired to assess the Shadowbrook property for potential purchase. He spent 3 days surveying the ruins and the land. On the final evening, as dusk fell, he reported seeing a group of children emerge from the tree line and walk toward the ruined foundation of the mansion. He described them as wearing white clothing that seemed to glow in the fading light, moving in perfect unison, silent. Tucker claimed he called out to them, thinking they were local children playing in a dangerous location. They did not respond or acknowledge his presence, but continued walking until they reached the foundation, at which point they simply disappeared. Tucker, badly shaken, left immediately and refused to return to complete his assessment. His employer at the time confirmed that Tucker had abandoned the job abruptly and would never discuss what had happened, except to say that Shadowbrook was not a place for the living. Are these accounts evidence of something supernatural, or are they the result of suggestion and folklore taking on a life of its own? The rationalist explanation would emphasize the power of storytelling to create shared beliefs, especially in communities with limited literacy and strong oral traditions. The Shadowbrook story was dramatic and tragic enough to spawn legends, and once such legends take root, they tend to perpetuate themselves through generations. But there is another possibility, one that researchers have explored with caution. Could some of the sightings have been real people? If survivors of Jennifer's program existed, whether escapees from that final night or descendants of the forced unions, might they have been drawn back to Shadowbrook over the years? Might the figures seen in the fields have been descendants searching for the truth about their origins? In 1978, the state of Alabama finally purchased the Shadowbrook property and the surrounding land, designating it as a historical site. Limited archaeological surveys were conducted, focusing on the mansion foundation and the known tunnel system. These surveys confirmed the presence of additional tunnels that had not been mapped in the 1930s, extending in directions that suggested a network even more extensive than previously believed. However, budget constraints prevented comprehensive excavation, and much of the site remains unexplored. The most recent development in the Shadowbrook case came in 1989, when a metal-detecting hobbyist discovered, buried approximately 2 feet deep near the riverbank, a metal box similar to the one found in the tunnels in 1931. This box contained additional pages from what appeared to be Jennifer Whitmore's journals, written in the same cipher. The decoding of these pages, completed by a team from Auburn University, revealed Jennifer's thoughts from the days immediately preceding the disappearance. One passage stands out: "I have prepared them as best I can. The children understand their purpose now. They are no longer afraid of the dark places. They sing the old songs I have taught them. T has stopped fighting. M has embraced her role. W sees the necessity. Tomorrow we complete the circle. Tomorrow we become what Shadowbrook needs us to be. If we are found, let them wonder, let them fear. The Dynasty is not meant for their understanding. What was Jennifer planning to complete? What did she mean by becoming what Shadowbrook needs?" The fragmented evidence refuses to coalesce into a definitive answer, and perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the case. We can document the horror but not fully comprehend it. 167 years have passed since the night of August 12, 1858, when Jennifer Whitmore and her family vanished from Shadowbrook Plantation. Despite decades of investigation, archaeological discoveries, and the decoding of Jennifer's journals, we are no closer to understanding the complete truth of what transpired in those tunnels beneath the Alabama soil. Three primary theories have emerged over the years, each with supporting evidence and each with significant gaps. The first theory, favored by many historians, is that Jennifer Whitmore was suffering from severe mental illness, possibly exacerbated by the death of her husband and the social isolation she imposed upon herself. Her delusions about creating an eternal dynasty through ritual and pseudoscience drove her to manipulate her children into participating in the forced breeding program. On the night of the disappearance, according to this theory, Jennifer convinced or coerced her family to enter the tunnel system, where she administered poison or orchestrated suffocation, believing this would complete some form of transformation. The family died together in the underground chambers, their bodies partially preserved by the cool, dry conditions until the tunnels began to flood in later decades. This theory explains the remains, found in 1931, and the ritual positioning of the bones, but it cannot account for all 14 children or definitively prove that the remains were those of the Whitmore family. The second theory, proposed by genealogists and supported by oral histories, suggests that the disappearance was actually a planned escape. According to this theory, Jennifer's entire program was not a cult ritual, but rather a calculated plan to create a new community free from the social constraints of the antebellum South. The forced unions, while morally reprehensible, were Jennifer's way of binding enslaved people to her family in a manner that would create mutual dependency and loyalty. On the night of the storm, the family and the children fled through the tunnel system, which extended further than the mapped sections suggest, possibly to a waiting boat on the Alabama River. They disappeared into the frontier territories of the West, or perhaps to a foreign country, living out their lives under assumed identities. This theory explains the systematic removal of all personal belongings and the lack of bodies definitively identified as the Whitmores, but it cannot account for the remains found in the tunnels or the ritual arrangements discovered there. The third theory, whispered rather than formally proposed, suggests something more disturbing. What if Jennifer's beliefs about binding her bloodline to Shadowbrook were not entirely delusional? What if she had discovered or believed she had discovered some actual process, chemical or psychological, that could be enacted through her rituals? This theory does not invoke the supernatural, but rather suggests that Jennifer might have been experimenting with substances or practices that had real effects, however misunderstood. The behavior of the children, described as moving in unison and speaking in strange patterns, might have been the result of poisoning, malnutrition, or psychological conditioning. The transformation Jennifer sought might have been not mystical, but rather the complete psychological breaking and rebuilding of her victims into a state of absolute dependence and control. Under this theory, the family died in the tunnels not through poison or suffocation, but through the cumulative effects of years of abuse, finally succumbing on that August night. Their bodies were arranged in ritual positions not by Jennifer, but by survivors who later returned to memorialize them in the only way they knew. This theory is the darkest because it suggests the horror extended over years rather than a single night, and that the true victims, the children, suffered fates worse than death before dying. To this day, no one knows the truth. The Shadowbrook property, now overgrown with forest and marked only by a small historical plaque, stands as a monument to questions without answers. The tunnel system, partially collapsed and extremely dangerous, remains largely unexplored. The journals of Jennifer Whitmore, even decoded, raise more questions than they resolve. The remains found in the underground chambers were never definitively identified and have since been interred in an unmarked collective grave in the county cemetery. What we do know is that Jennifer Whitmore's obsession destroyed lives in ways both documented and speculated. We know that her program of forced reproduction constituted one of the most systematic abuses of power in a region and era already defined by systematic abuse. We know that the children born from this program, whether they died in 1858 or somehow survived, were victims of horrors perpetrated by someone who should have protected them. The Shadowbrook case reminds us that the greatest monsters often wear the mask of respectability. Jennifer Whitmore was educated, wealthy, and by many accounts intelligent. She used these advantages not to improve the world, but to bend it to her twisted vision. And in the end, that vision consumed her, her children, and countless others, whose names we will never know. If you found this investigation compelling, if the questions it raises disturb you as they should, I ask you to subscribe to our channel and join our community of truth seekers. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share your theories in the comments below. What do you believe happened in those tunnels beneath Shadowbrook? Do you think Jennifer Whitmore was simply insane, or was there method to her madness? Do you believe anyone survived that night? Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Alabama's darkest mysteries. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly buried. Sometimes it waits beneath our feet, in tunnels we have yet to discover, holding secrets we may never fully understand. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next investigation.